Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey everybody, and thanks for joining me on another solo episode of the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. This week we are diving into intentional culture. What is it? How do we build it? The kind of different tipping points or things that ultimately happen that drive intentional culture through my experience. So again, as a reminder, this is an extension of our weekly newsletter, Business System Saturday. So if you're interested in checking that out, you can find it out on the website. You know, intentional culture for me, again, I think some people look at this as maybe a bit of a slogan or a catchphrase. But the reality is, as a guy that kind of grew up being a transition person or growing into a transition person, right? So in a couple of my assignments during my corporate days, I had an opportunity to transform culture. I was taking over within a leadership role that required me to do so, and so I've experienced that. I led that, and I've also had what I'll say, kind of growing up, right? Like my first leadership job was when I graduated high school and was late teens, early 20s, and so for me, having a bit of growing up and maturing and, a bit of change of heart and seeing the things that worked and didn't work, I experienced, intentional culture that way as well, right? Through kind of a change of heart and growing really into those roles. So that's what today is all about. And so again, I love this topic for a variety of reasons. Where I think it makes the most sense is to kind of define what intentional culture is. And I think the easiest way to do that is to talk about what it's not. A lot of people I find think that culture is your mission statement or your values, the things that you've kind of defined from maybe a, customer facing perspective, or you've got it on the website or up on your wall as a slogan. All of those things are not culture, right? Culture, I heard it put a really great way the other day, right? But culture, from my definition, my perspective, it is how your people articulate, right? Like how they feel about what's happening in your organization, right? It's not top down. It's not what you say about it as a person in leadership. It is what your direct reports and even indirect reports are saying about the confines and the actions and the things that are happening on the daily. That's what culture is, right? So the way I heard it the other day, which I really liked, and I feel like I've seen this before, but, bears repeating. It's the culture is how your people feel on Sunday night, right? So you hear a lot of people talk about the Sunday scaries or, it's another Monday, right? So I like that thought process, because it brings it back down to the people that are doing the work, the people that are navigating the problems, dealing with the tasks, all throughout your organization. And you can say whatever you want from a leadership perspective. You can tell your customers whatever you want, but I guarantee that your customers and all the folks across the team, they know what the culture of your organization is, right? So what is intentional culture? Intentional culture is about choosing to actively shape that, right? Now, that doesn't mean that every day is perfect, that you're never going to make mistakes, that you're never going to, lose your mind over something, right? Like that is not what I'm talking about. But there are ways to approach culture. There's ways to approach when you make a mistake, right? Like you own that, you fess up to it. You don't run away from it. You don't hide it. You talk about like what was underneath it, how you plan to move forward, all these things, right? And I think sometimes we as leaders think we have to be, superhuman in some sense, right? Like, that we can't have bad days, or that, we can't make mistakes, and that's all part of this process. So intentional culture for me is all about actively choosing, here's what I want my people to feel like when they're in this building, when we're working on a problem, when we're working on a project, all of these things, right? I've got a couple of members of the Chrysler Club right now that are in these scenarios where there are a lot of, silos that exist, right? Like, don't love using buzzwords, but that's literally what they are. These are larger organizations that have a lot of specific, departments and functionality, kind of a lot of process bounds, if you will. They've got some leadership layers in them as well. And what happens as problems arise is that kind of naturally, certain sets of folks are kind of working towards that, but they're working towards that by themselves. They're not bringing in other people, other stakeholders that, these efforts ultimately impact, right? So they're not getting a full picture. So what happens? There's miscommunication. There's a feeling of distrust across the organization. There's a feeling of distrust up and down within the organization, from direct labor and kind of people doing the thing, all the way up through executive leadership. So this stuff touches everywhere, and if you're not careful, it's like the that saying about it kind of only takes one negative thing to destroy 10 positive things, right? Culture is very much like that. It doesn't take a lot to start to erode it and ultimately disrupt it. It takes a really long time, a lot of focused effort, a lot of intentionality to build and to ultimately maintain, right, an intentional culture. So those are some of the dynamics that we are working within and around when it comes to culture and intentionality. So in terms of like, how do we get there, right? How do we build an intentional culture? There's obviously a bunch of different aspects and parts to this, but I've tried to distill it down to three main points. And point number one is a lesson that took me a really long time to learn. Again, for a variety of reasons. I was a young leader. I was in a different place in life than a lot of the folks that I was leading. I, grew up in a business that was, kind of very much in the age of, top-down leadership and all of those things, right? So no excuses. It just, it took me a long time to learn this. But the lesson is lead with empathy. Right? Nobody, most people don't like conflict. A lot of people completely avoid conflict. Difficult conversations doesn't necessarily have to be specifically conflict, right? But difficult conversations, giving feedback, like handling change, all of those different aspects, right? So, how does empathy play into that? Putting yourself in other people's shoes, recognizing that there are other dynamics within those people's lives that ultimately bring, show up in the workplace, right? So understanding, unpacking that, leading with empathy, actively listening to folks, like, in that sense, and trying to put yourself in their position, and so you can kind of see both sides. Tremendously beneficial, right? Again, it's like when people when people feel heard and obviously respected, they tend to buy into the things that you're saying, the things that you're trying to change. And again, none of this stuff is black and white, right? Lots of shades of gray, lots of movement on the spectrum both ways, as we're starting to talk about, transforming culture, or, again, kind of perpetuating perpetuating, right? Continuing on the track we've already done. So number two is it's a Gary V phrase, but I love it, and that's kind candor. And the thought process with this is, you have to I'll say it a different way, right? Like, so there's kind of this three-legged stool that any organization needs to make sure that they follow, right? And that is clarity, consistency, and accountability. A lot of what ends up happening in an organization is that we want to hold people accountable, but when we take a step back, oftentimes what I'm helping people to see is that they've not been clear, nor have they been consistent in their actions, right? So kind candor is kind of all about holding people accountable, being direct, giving good feedback, but not being disrespectful, not saying like, you're an idiot. This is what always happens. I knew I couldn't trust you, right? Like all of those other unnecessary and, extremely negative things to put into people's heads, right? So it's having a difficult conversation, but in a meaningful and productive way. And the way to that, in my opinion, is clarity, consistency, and, the third leg of that stool, right? Accountability. You can't hold people accountable if they don't know what is expected. Again, a lot of times I hear the feedback, of course they know, it's obvious. What may be obvious to you is, I would almost guarantee, out of sight, out of mind for the people that you're talking to. You have access to different information as a leader. Plain and simple. So if you have access to additional information, additional context, can put it into the larger picture of the things that you're seeing, oftentimes the people that you're holding accountable have a very narrow focus. They don't have all of the context. Therefore, it becomes very difficult to be on the same page of what is clarity, right? Consistency, the other piece of that is, is it green today and blue tomorrow? Maybe some self-reflection will help you unpack that, right? You have to be extremely, extremely consistent in your messaging, consistent in your action, consistent with your emotion, right? As a leader, you can't have really high highs and really low lows. You have to be in the middle. You have to be even keeled, right? Like, to become an effective leader. Those are some of the things. The third thing is mostly related to, the change management aspect, right? So that kind of transformation piece. And if we're being intentional with our culture, chances are we're going to be navigating some change with that. So for me, that's the why and the what before the how, right? And I've talked a lot about this in previous newsletters, previous podcasts, and a lot of content. But very quickly, it is all about saying, like, why now, right? Like, why this change? Why now? Why do we believe this thing's going to have an impact, right? Like, on our organization, for our clients, for our customers, all of the whys. Okay. The what, people get this wrong, right? The what isn't like, oh, what are we going to do? Like, that's the how. Okay. The what is, what about me? Okay. And it's what about me from the people that this change will ultimately impact, right? Ultimately, everybody is selfish. Everybody wants to know what's in it for me. So when we talk about the why and the what, we have to talk about what the impact is for the people, right? Because that's what they're going to be most curious about. Am I going to be laid off? Is this going to increase my workload? Is this going to make my workload lighter? Are we going to have more resources available? Are we going to have less resources? Are we going to have more time, less time? Are we going to have more money, less money, right? It's all of those types of questions. So getting out in front of, change, right? The why and the what, then you could start to bring people into the how. So again, a lot of people will say, like, well, what are we going to do? That's fine, right? I don't care if you kind of use the terminology a bit different, right? But like, the what for a lot of people is really the how. How are we going to do this? What is the best way to go about this, right? Is it a process change? Is it a tool? Is it an additional team member, right? Like, all of that kind of question, you can start to solicit and ultimately prioritize those different ideas. So I want to talk a little bit about ultimately what kind of leads to transforming change, right? Like, how do we transform a culture that starts to get off track? Because again, this isn't something generally that just happens, right? This is a period of time. It starts to erode and kind of goes down a path. Or there is a kind of trigger event, if you will, right? And somebody could come into that. So the first scenario, which I got a lot of practice at, was a leadership change, right? Taking over at an organization that maybe the culture had been eroding, maybe the culture has been completely eroded or is completely gone, right? Like, that certainly is one avenue, one aspect of like, where's that start? How do we go anywhere but up from here, right? Like, that kind of thought process. What becomes really challenging in these scenarios, and again, learn this from firsthand experience, is that a lot of the folks that are there, like, they've either cycled through. So you've got like kind of two pools of people. You've got people that have seen it all, been there, done it all, heard it all, right? Have gone up, have come back down, and they're kind of like the people that are the lifers there, right? Then you've got those are usually the salty people, right? Like, and then you've got they're great workers, right? Don't get me wrong, they're amazing workers, but they're salty from a culture perspective, right? Because they've been burned before. It's like, I've heard this before. This just a bunch of lip service. Nothing's really going to change. Nobody's ever going to listen to me, so on and so forth, right? So then you've got the pool of, kind of generally speaking, like, new talent, people that have been there for a while, the folks that are cycling, and they're getting, the salty, right? Like, they're like, this place sucks. I don't know why you even want to come here. Like, it's like, well, why are you here? So it's always those dynamics. But like, this is, again, people are going to think I'm nuts, right? But like, I'll never tell you this at the time, like, having gone through it, coming out the other side multiple times now, it's kind of one of those unique scenarios where you really get to you really get to see not just people transform, people buy into that vision, but you see this kind of whole entire genesis and transformation kind of right before your eyes, right? Like, there's so much hard activity and tough conversations and all that, like, tough stuff. But as you start to see some, like, as I say, it's like the quick wins build momentum, right? Like, so as you start to see some of that, that reinforcement, that consistency, that clarity, as you start to see that stuff, like, come on, like, people slowly, very slowly, will kind of open up, start to offer another idea, right? Start to offer some additional insight. And so it's this really fun thing, ultimately, to see that transformation unfold. There's kind of nothing better. One of my favorite books kind of on this subject specifically is by L. David Marquette, called "Turn the Ships Around," or "Turn the Ship Around." And if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite stories. Basically, the kind of worst performing, nuclear submarine in the whole fleet. It's the story of transformation from going from, last to first. And it's beyond kind of inspirational, right? Like, there's a lot of practicality in it. But I love the story. I love that book. And so if you're either in the midst of this, you found yourself in a scenario where, you're taking over and having to do one of these intentional culture shifts, do yourself a favor and pick up that book. I don't think you'll be disappointed in that. The other, kind of thing or factor, and I alluded to this earlier, is, kind of having a change of heart, right? For me, it wasn't so much a change of heart. It was more of a maturing and kind of seeing the things that worked and that didn't work. And again, I talked a little bit about it from, like, the empathy perspective, right? Like, I was a single guy in my 20s leading people that were, in their 40s, in their 50s, that had families, that had kids. Like some of them had kids that were close to my age, right? So I couldn't relate when people would tell me like, I have this family obligation or I can't stay, I got to do this. It's like it didn't mean anything to me because that wasn't my life, And now I look back on that, having a child and having a family, it's like, oh my gosh, like what a terrible leader I was for so long. And, that's a really hard kind of reflection and thing to say. And I'm grateful for having learned those lessons and kind of, again, learned them the hard way. But man, I could have been so much more effective had I, opened myself up a bit more and, done some kind of internal work to learn about like that empathy piece and the kind candor and all of those things, right? So that's why I'm sharing this stuff, with folks today. It's all those hard learned lessons of, 25 plus years of leading people and doing this stuff, right? So, but for you, maybe you are a salty leader, right? And maybe you haven't led the most effective way. Maybe you, recognize in yourself that, you like to sit in a specific part of the organization and that you need support in a different part of the organization, right? All of that is totally cool. And I love folks that have this realization and a bit of change of heart and say, you know what? I don't want my people to have the Sunday scaries. I don't want people to, kind of dread not just coming to work, but being at work and having a lot of dysfunction across our organization when problems do arise. I want people to work collaboratively. I want people to feel as though that they're heard and not just heard, but, respected and responded to, right? That, man, can move mountains. Okay. And the easiest way, I shouldn't say the easiest way, the way to start to do that is to own it, right? You can't hide from what has already transpired. People have a really long memory in these scenarios. And so you got to own it. You got to fall on your sword. You got to ask for forgiveness. You have to lay out a vision of what you want to be different. Again, clarity, consistency, accountability for yourself, right? Lay out that vision of what clarity, is going to be. Consistency, right? Got to walk the walk, man. And that's tough for people, right? When you have this change of heart, that can be very, very difficult. But what I say is, again, it's okay to make mistakes. If you make a mistake, then own it. Call in all hands. Hey, this happened. This was what was going on behind the scenes. Sorry, that wasn't cool. I need your help holding myself accountable for this stuff, right? Like, be a human, show up, have a conversation with people, right? And you'll be surprised. Again, this isn't, you're going to have one meeting and it's going to be puppies and rainbows and everybody's going to be giving you a high five and patting you on the back. Oh, Dave, thanks so much for, really showing up today. That is not reality. Okay. It is a lot of hard work. Again, a lot of clarity, a lot of consistency, and some accountability. So, and that all happens, at a variety of leadership levels. And it depends on, ultimately where you're kind of meeting this challenge. Right. So, yeah, I guess I'll stop there. Rome wasn't built in a day, I think is the phrase. Culture takes time. But again, it takes clarity, consistency, and accountability above all things. And it's not impossible. It's like any other change activity. I would say it is up there in terms of difficulty level. Because again, it only takes a little bit of erosion to really slip back, and that is felt internally and externally by your customers. So thanks so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, comments, would love to hear them. Always here to answer specific questions based on your scenario, your resource source pool. And I do all of that for free. So, love talking about this stuff. Could literally talk about it for days on end. So thanks for tuning in and catch you on the next episode. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.